Our speaker tonight, Leighton Christiansen, is new to the DOT. He just took over the librarianship in the archive at the DOT in
End of July.
End of July. So he has been here now quite a year. He took the position, and so when we asked him if he would put together a talk in honor of the Centennial DOT, he was willing, even eager. And so preparing the talk, this talk tonight has been his full immersion baptism into the history of transportation in Iowa. So please give Leighton a big welcome on his maiden voyage into DOT history.
Tonight's presentation, Iowa Department of Transportation, Centennial, 100 years of contributions to Ames, our state, and the nation. I want to thank the Ames Historical Society for inviting me here tonight, and thank everybody who came out tonight in the snow. Now, who else today, this is the part of the audience participation part, there'll be a lot of that tonight. Who else today fell down getting out of their car in the snow? How many people parked their car in virgin parking area and the hot tires melted it down to ice and had to be towed out? You're killing me here. How is this? I'm the only one this happened to. I'm a native Iowan. I mean, I shouldn't be the only one this is happening to. A little bit more about my background. As Kathy said, this is sort of my baptism by fire. I have what I would call a seat of the pants understanding of transportation in Iowa. I spent 3 years in Iowa City as a school bus driver and 15 years driving a truck based here in Iowa and around the Midwest. So if I was driving with my eyes closed, I could sort of read the bumps, but not that I would ever do that. I know you all think truck drivers do that. That's not true. I've seen that episodes of The Simpsons. There's no cruise control like that. So I've come through transportation sort of the other way. And from what the folks on the search committee, when I applied for the job, tell me, they thought, oh yeah, we want to see what happens when you put a truck driver in charge of the library. They were real excited about that. And so here we are. Now, I'm the one up here talking with you all tonight, and thanking you all for coming, but one person doesn't do this job. I am part of the 100th Anniversary Planning Committee, and you can see the names of the other folks on the committee up here, as well as many people whose names aren't up here. An organization as old as the Iowa DOT, there have been thousands and thousands of people who've worked for the DOT who have made the history that we're going to talk about tonight, who have collected the information, collected the artifacts, the photographs that you'll see tonight, who put together the information, put together the website that we'll talk about tonight, who have made the history and that we'll be sharing with you. And so I want to take a minute, because some of these folks on the planning committee tonight, especially those folks in information, are at work tonight because of the snowstorm. And of course, our crews are out, plowing, trying to keep the road safe. So if you would join me, please, in recognizing all those people for their hard work. Now, the folks on this committee, they come from all different departments in the DOT. They come from all 6 districts. There's engineers, there's folks from rail, there's the librarian, there's folks from information, there's some retirees giving of their own time to help us celebrate 100 years of the DOT. And we're planning a number of activities throughout the state over the course of the coming year. There'll be open houses at DOT headquarters here in Ames and at the district offices around the state. There'll be museum shows, as was mentioned, at the Octagon. And we're trying to locate some other museums who'd be interested. So if you know of anything, let me know. As it turns out, I am the museum liaison for the 100th Anniversary Planning Committee, so please let me know. I'm happy to get in contact with your favorite museum. One of the most important things that we're doing this 100th anniversary year is getting that information out to the people in Iowa. And one of the ways that we're doing that, besides presentations and other events, is by creating a new section to the Iowa DOT website, which is the Iowa DOT history. And vital to that history is the timeline. And as the year goes on, we'll fill in more events. And so you can go onto the website, and the website's kind of fun, kind of interactive. I mean, over here under conversations, you can look at stories that we're posting, and you can leave comments. And then the timeline scrolls side to side, and If you click on the different pictures, they open up, and sometimes there's movies. I think there's about 45 minutes worth of movies to watch. If you're interested, the old your Iowa Highway Commission movies from the 60s. And if nothing else, you've got to look at the cars. I mean, they're amazing. The big fins and the things left over from the cars in the 60s were just incredible. And we're going to look tonight at the Iowa DOT, its history, its connection to Ames, and we'll look at scenes in Iowa's transportation history that had nothing to do with the DOT, aside from the fact that the DOT is sort of delayed in infrastructure for much of the transportation of the 20th century. Some of the history we're going to talk about tonight were made by DOT employees, and others simply made by the citizens of Iowa. So, who is the DOT? Well, the Iowa Department of Transportation is made up of many, many different offices covering different modes of transportation. Up here, you've got aviation, highway, train, very excitingly, walking and biking trails, public transit, and then, of course, down here on the bottom is driver services and motor vehicle services. And for most of you, you're probably most familiar with highways and motor vehicle, because you've all had to stand in line to get your driver's license at some point, and you've had to get a vehicle licensed. And I can make that assumption very generally based on the fact that in 2011, there were more than 4 million vehicles registered in the state of Iowa. Cars, trucks, buses, trailers, whatnot. That's a lot of license plates to put out. And of the 3 million people living in the state of Iowa, about 2 million of us have driver's licenses. And there are days as we're going to the state football game, it seems like we're all here in Ames and not able to get around in town, or Iowa City by alma mater. People always ask me that at work, why aren't you wearing your state colors? I'm agnostic on that question, but I thought I would tease you all about it. So that's to say that the Department of Transportation, in one way or another, touches all aspects of life, leisure, and commerce in the state of Iowa. And we have people at the DOT who are working to make sure that those modes of transportation are safe, are well maintained, are built to standards and regulations that will last for decades, which is a very different story than what was happening in the 1800s. And we'll see some instances of that later on. And really the DOT is creating a transportation infrastructure that is a public good beneficial to all of us. And I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind. So this is the original building for the DOT. And it says at the top of this slide, 2 names, several additions, and 1 address, more or less. Of course, the DOT started its history as the Iowa Highway Commission, and in 1913. But even before that, in 1904, the legislature created an advisory highway commission based just down the street at Iowa State College, as it was called then, in the engineering department. The dean of engineering, Anson Marston, was head of the commission. And the problem with an advisory body is it had no actual power when dealing with roads and bridges that were built in shoddy ways. And so in 1913, wanting a body with actual enforceable powers, the legislature then created the Iowa State Highway Commission as a standalone government agency all of its own. Although its offices were still in the engineering building, and some of its staff was still at Iowa State. And that is really a tradition that extends to today. I work quite a bit with the folks at the Institute for Transportation at Iowa State. So and they do a lot of research for the DOT, so that's still a tight connection between us. In 1919, when it looked like the Highway Commission was going to be a permanent body, then the legislature told the Highway Commission, get some money, build a building. You're going to need some offices. As it happens, the city and citizens of Ames took out a donation subscription, sort of like the $3 at the door. They had people subscribe. They gathered $16,500, and they bought the 5 acres of land south on Lincoln Way, where the DOT offices currently are. That building was built for a grand total of $123,000 and is still part of the complex. Now, over the years, the building space has changed as the needs of transportation has changed in Iowa. Laboratories have been added, a maintenance garage, a warehouse, and those are to the south of the old building. Another office complex, you know, the part that's pink, and it sort of looks like a high school that was built in the 1960s. That was added, and that's all offices. And at the west end of the original building, 5 of the 8 original machine sheds that were used to house World War I surplus maintenance equipment that the Iowa Highway Commission used to maintain roads. 5 of those 8 sheds have been removed, and others have been turned into office space. A new administration suite was added in the 60s, and that's the main entrance now if you come to visit. And finally, maybe some folks remember that at one point, there was a rail line that ran south of town, south of downtown Ames, that was abandoned and is now the extension of Grand Avenue coming south of Lincoln Way. And that whole area was reconfigured, and now you have a high V instead of a railway running through there. But it's not only the building and its layout that have changed. In the mid-1960s, the U.S. government had also many different transportation offices. It combined all these offices into one single, all-encompassing Department of Transportation. And over the next coming years, all the states pretty much followed suit, including Iowa in 1974. The Iowa Highway Commission, the largest and most important transportation division in Iowa at the time, because it encompassed the most state dollars, became the home for the Iowa Department of Transportation. And so it is from these beginnings that we trace our centennial. So let's look at a few highlights that are currently featured on the Iowa DOT timeline, and later on, as we move through the night, we'll talk about a few that we're still working on, that we're writing up, and that will be included. Now, obviously, we sort of start here with the creation of the Highway Commission in 1913. Now, the Commission's job, according to the legislature, was to conduct public highway demonstrations, disseminate information to county supervisors, formulate standards for highway repair and construction, and investigate road problems in Iowa, and then record and report the progress to the governor every fiscal year, and also report to the citizens of the state. The Iowa Highway Commission did laboratory testing of the properties of Iowa road materials. What kind of soil makes the best road bed? What sort of rock is the best gravel for gravel surfaces? What are the properties of Portland concrete after it's been under wear or freeze and thaw over a number of years? That was one of the slides that went by, was the cores, the concrete cores. Other initiatives included testing and designing concrete culverts. Everybody who lives in Iowa knows that you can't go more than a few blocks without running into a creek or a stream or some other body of water or some other depression in the land. And that water has to go someplace as it flows under our bridges and under our roads, and culverts are important for that, although we don't think about it. I didn't include a lot of slides of culverts. I don't think any, because they're not fun to look at. They're not very sexy, like a train speeding down the road or an accident site. So they didn't get included, but they're vital. And we study things like the outflow, the inflow and outflow of water moving through them, which I won't pretend to say that I understand. Also, the Highway Commission was responsible for the mapping of the state of Iowa and the county. The Commission invested in a road school in June of 1905. A day was spent with demonstration and discussion about culvert construction and road machinery and how it operates, tools that highway engineers use, and there were lectures from engineers. And then after becoming a state body in 1913, the Highway Commission, in conjunction with the Department of Justice in Iowa, attempted to resolve many of the detrimental business practices. Oh, let's not beat around the bush. The graft at the county level, where, because roads and bridges were the responsibility of counties, and mayors and supervisors all had brothers and brothers-in-law who needed jobs, and these guys would go build roads and bridges that then, on the first good rain, or the first time somebody drove a tractor over it, would collapse. And this was a chronic problem. Pretty much in every state at one point or another, but in Iowa in the late 1800s. And that was one of the first jobs of the commission, was to create standards for building that would then assure that the funds were spent well and spent wisely. One of the other reasons that Iowa needed the Iowa Highway Commission was mud. This is a picture that the folks down in the digitization lab at work refer to as the Mona Lisa. Because that poor guy in the car has some enigmatic expression on his face. Somewhere between a grimace and a grin, I think he's just wondering about the person who's taking his pictures. Like, how are you doing? Come push the car. You can see that the car is axle deep, much like my story with the snow today. He's axle deep in that mud, or as Iowans used to say of their roads, of their earth roads at the time, they're as deep as they are wide. And on a good rainy day, you found that out. And at the time, what's sort of amazing when you think about the state of Iowa, as we turn the century, Iowa became a state in the 1830s, and its first official road ran from Keokuk to Iowa City, which was the capital at the time, the territorial capital. By the period this picture has been taken, by the turn of the century, there's 104,000 miles of dirt roads in the state of Iowa. I mean, we often think of Iowa as a small place. It's got a smaller population, but it's not necessarily a small state in any way, shape, or form. 35 to 38 million acres. It's not small. And so there's 104,000 miles of road by this point. Now, the Highway Commission's job was to help get us out of the mud. And don't try to read that. Basically, what it tells you is, in 1920, of the primary roads, and what I mean by primary roads, out of the 104,000 miles of road, the most important 6,000 or 7,000 miles were the roads that were the state highways, were the federal highways, were the roads that connected up the capital to the county seats. There's 99 counties in Iowa. Each one has a county seat, the seat of government. It was the roads that connected the capitals of the counties to the capital of the state and to each other. Those were the important roads. Those are the roads we were most concerned about. And the roads that carried the most traffic, which carried 80% of the traffic. You can see that in 1920, that only 67 miles were paved. And paved could mean concrete or asphalt. We're not done. Timer went off telling me I was done. I'm like, I just started. And by 1930, of that growing number of miles, 7,000 miles, 6,000 was surfaced either with concrete, asphalt, or gravel, and about 1,000 was still dirt. So it was a big job, and it took a lot of money and a lot of person power to get to that point, even in a decade. And one of the reasons it takes that long is that if you have to put up forms for forming up your road, even if your road is only a lane or two wide, the best you can do doing this all manually at the time, with the state of the science at the time, is a strip about 1,000 feet long, football field including its end zones, for a day's work, for a good day's work. So it takes a long time. Doing 7,000 miles, it takes a long time to get all that done. Anybody recognize this intersection? It's here in town. Yep, well, where? Not that far, actually, from here.
It's like 13th Street?
16th and Grand, exactly. And when the potholes got really deep, you put a couple planks over it, hope nobody fell in. This is still a road repair method used in Chicago, actually. When you get a pothole, you throw a steel plate down on it and hope it's good for a year or two. Fortunately, Iowa's moved beyond that. And here's that same intersection today, same view. You'll notice you can't quite see the two houses. You can see the houses were at address 1719 and 1720. You can't quite see them in this picture because of the trees and whatnot. But, that's US 69 now, as we refer to it. That's a primary road because it's a US highway. And 4 lanes wide. And sadly, that intersection at 13th has the longest light in the world. Who knows? Who else? I mean, I go around that. Anybody else do that? One of the other main reasons, as I discussed a little bit ago, was building standards. Because as traffic increased in the early 20th century. The thing we have to remember is that Iowa had basically no cars in 1900. And very quickly, in those first couple of decades, you get the birth of the automobile and the birth of powered farm equipment. And at the first couple of decades of the 20th century in Iowa, there were 200,000 family farms. 200,000 farms, average size 160 acres. That's a lot of farms. That's a lot of farm equipment. And it kept getting bigger. You think about the equipment now. You drive by 80, down Interstate 80, you go by Kinsey, and you see their giant 24 or 36-row planters that they use as a windmill. The move from horses hauling your plow to having, steam-powered was also was a huge leap in the efficiency of the farmer's time. But these things got heavier and wider, and this one happens to have steel wheels, and roads and bridges obviously weren't built for the added weight, or were built by somebody's brother-in-law and collapsed. I hope that guy wasn't hurt when that bridge collapsed, but that was a cause of fatalities in Iowa at the time, was improper equipment on roads and bridges that would collapse. And part of what the Highway Commission had to do was keep this from happening, was to help make our roads safer. Another thing that the Highway Commission did to help make roads safer, starting in 1926, was painting a line on the road. Now you think that's kind of silly, or you go to get in line at the movie theater and you've got to walk through those standards that we have a nice queue, and then people stay on their own in line and take their turns. But as you know, even in this part of the century, there was distracted driving. We call them children, and people would move over the center of the road or get up on the crown, and you would have a number of head-on collisions. And one of the ways that the Iowa Highway Commission wanted to address that was they painted a center stripe down the road. Now this is black, and as you can imagine, on a rainy night or in the dark, that's not very visible. So black lasted until about 1954, when they moved to the reflectorized white and yellow that we're all familiar with now, the dashed line down the middle, permitting passing, and the solid lines when you can. So, and it took 3 years to finish changing over all the black lines to yellow or white, and on the primary roads. And besides making the interstates and the highways safer, there was also the matter of regulating drivers and raising money, of course, for the repair of those roads, the construction and repair of those roads. The first operator's license, generally, was required starting in 1932. And you paid for it. And you signed a card that basically said, yes, I'm competent to drive a car. And the sheriff gave you your license, and off you went, whether you were competent or not. That's a little frightening. But the actual, and you can see if you go out in the lobby, one of the posters that I brought with me today is pictures of the different license styles through the decades. And you can see some of the very earliest ones as well as some of the more recent ones. But the actual first licenses were required in Iowa in 1919. And those were for people classified as chauffeurs, people who were actually chauffeuring other people around in cars and cabs and buses, or people driving larger vehicles. So, I've been talking for a little bit now, and so now we're going to take a little bit of a break. And this is also a good time for movement. So those who can, I'm going to ask you to stand up. This will help keep you warm if you stand up. If you don't want to get up, just put both your hands up. Little movement here. All right, so here's the question. The first automobiles in Iowa were showcased at the Lynn County Fair in 1899, and were slow to catch on in the state. In what year did Iowa first require cars to be registered and display license plate tags or plates? And if you think the answer was 1900, you can sit down. If you think the answer was 1904, you can sit down. If you think the answer was 1908, you can sit down. And if you think the answer was D, 1912, you can sit down. And if you're just tired of standing, you can sit down too. So the actual correct answer was was 1904. Which was fairly early, because at the time, there's a grand total of, that's a later question, I'm not going to tell you that. There's not very many cars when we start requiring those licenses. On April 12, 1904, the state legislature first required registration of motor vehicles and regulated their use on the highways. The registration fee was $1, a bargain. The certificate of registration was the round aluminum medallion that you see here. And that was the thing that you had to screw to the dashboard of the car. This was like permanent, and this registered you. The plate then that you added, you could go to the store, the general store, and buy a plate or buy the materials for a plate, which were basically house numbers. And this one happens to be leather with house numbers riveted to it. And that had to be visible front and back. You were completely responsible for your own. And the state didn't actually begin manufacturing license plates until 1911. And the disc obviously is greatly enlarged to show you the details. You can see it from the front row. But it's only about 3.5 inches in diameter. It's not tremendously big. And one of the questions that I get a lot at the DOT library is this precise question: when did we first require license plates? And we can talk about whether or not there's license plates for every year or not. And that's another one of the banners back out in the hallway. So, trivia question number 2. Don't bother standing up this time, you can just raise your hands. How many cars were registered in Iowa in 1904? The first answer, A, 1 car. Anybody think there was just 1 car? One way in the back, excellent, full sold. B, 582 cars. Good selection. C, 931 cars. A little fewer than B. And D, 1,398 cars. And how many people just didn't even try? Thank you for being honest. I saw some of you were playing along. The answer was C, 931. And this isn't a car from 1904 because I couldn't find a picture. This is a Stanley steamer from 1910. Third trivia question, cars and drivers. And this is the one I get asked frequently too. And that I'm actually working on with some folks in Iowa City to find out this exact information in every state, is when was the first automobile crash fatality in Iowa? You've got 4 choices: 1903, 1905, 1907, and 1909. Hands for 1903. All right. Hands for 1905. Hands for 1907. And hands for 1909. Okay, those of you who said 1905 had it. And here's a picture from the scene of the accident. Imagine paparazzi in 1905. The photo caption, which was added later by somebody at the Iowa Highway Commission, reads as follows. This was the first chapter of a tragic serial story that will never have an ending. The story of Iowa's first fatal motor vehicle accident. It occurred 3 miles south of Hampton on what is now Highway 65 on September 29, 1905. The driver, F.A. Harriman, a Hampton attorney, was killed when traveling 30 miles an hour. He struck a bridge and went over the embankment. His companions, A.W. Bede, G.W. Bede, H.W. Harrison, and A. Engels were injured. The car is believed to have been an Oldsmobile, but it's a little hard to tell. And that caption says something that this is a serial problem. It's a problem that we still have, despite our safer roads. The peak year for auto fatalities in Iowa was, anybody want to throw out a guess? 1970. 60s is very close. The 60s were a little bit of a slaughterhouse as well. 1970 was sort of the peak with 912 auto fatalities for that year. In 2011, the last year that we finished doing the figures for, 364 auto-related fatalities, so just under 1 a day. Quite a difference. And the lowest level since 1943 and 1944, when obviously during World War II there was gas rationing, and the fatalities were 304 and 310 each. But other sides of the war years, fatalities were of in the 600s and 700s. So, this is a serious issue still, and it's one that the Iowa DOT spends a lot of time doing education on. This year we've had, in the past year since I've been librarian at the DOT, we've had a number of distracted driving related incidents where people are driving down the wrong lane on the interstate and running head on into somebody else. One of them was somebody watching a video on a computer, watching a DVD on a computer. Others obviously are texting and whatnot. And while we want you at the DOT to, if you have a smartphone, we want you to download the 511 Iowa app, which has the live updates of the street conditions, and which I can attest is very, very good. Having been out in that awful snowstorm on December 19th or 20th, whenever that one was, trying to get down to Osceola, I can attest that our app is very accurate. It's still, we don't want you looking at it while you're driving, so please don't. So let's talk about the history of a couple of the other modes of transportation in Iowa. Water, rail, and air. And I'm leaving a few things out tonight because there's only, an hour or so to talk. But as you found out, I seem to be capable of more than that. So, we can do this again another time. Iowa water navigation has an interesting history. It is probably the oldest mode of transportation aside from plain human-powered walking. Obviously, Iowa is bounded by water on both ends, but there are other navigable rivers in Iowa, obviously depending on the size of the equipment. The navigable rivers in Iowa include the Mississippi, the Maquoketa, the Cedar, the Iowa, the Skunk, the Des Moines, and the Missouri River, and other rivers to a lesser extent. In 1930, Congress authorized a 9-foot deep channel for the Mississippi River between Minneapolis and the mouth of the Missouri River just above St. Louis. Now, you might be saying to yourself, now wait a minute, why do we have to worry about the depth of the Mississippi? It's the father of waters. Steamboats were navigating it in the 1800s. The first steamboat came to Iowa in the 1830s. Why is this an issue? Well, over its length, over its hundreds of miles of length, the Mississippi is as shallow as 3 feet at its headwaters and as deep as 200 feet just north of New Orleans. But other places it varies wildly. The Des Moines Rapids, which were down by Burlington and Keokuk, where the Des Moines River joins the Mississippi, were only about 5 feet deep. And because of the rapids, were very hard to navigate, even for boats of the 1800s. So the 9-foot deep channel project became the responsibility of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers rather than the Department of Transportation. Construction was performed primarily between the 1930s and 1940s, and maintenance improvements and construction of other structures continues to this day. As the result of the Corps' completion of the initial master project, there are 29 locks between Minneapolis and St. Louis, and there are 10 of those along the Iowa border, including at Harper's Ferry, Gutenberg, Dubuque, Bellevue, Clinton, LeClaire, Muscatine, and Keokuk. And as part of that creation of the 900-foot channel, that means more than 300 million tons of cargo is moved on the northern Mississippi every year. And that has a huge impact for agriculture, obviously. In Iowa, as a lot of grain gets put on barges and sent down to New Orleans and out to the rest of the world. But more than, that's not bad. But more than water, rail has been important to Iowa's transportation history. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, Civil War era to 1920, call it that, rail was the most important mode of transportation, moving almost all of freight once it got from the farm on its wagon to the rail yard, and 80% of the passengers for those several decades. This is the 1881 railroad map of the state of Iowa, and it's probably a little hard to see, but what's important at this point is you're looking at 5,000 to 6,000 miles of rail track in the state of Iowa at this time, 1881. There were 10 rail lines running from the east United States to the Mississippi, and then cross the Mississippi to head west to the Pacific. This is nationally. Of those 10, 5 of them come through Iowa. And this is important for the development of Iowa, because from this point forward, railroads decide where towns are located. Railroad steam engines running mostly on wood and coal where they can find it, and southern Iowa had coal and coal mines, and we'll get it there. The steam railroads needed towns every 10 miles or so. So you sort of look along the rail lines, and then the state gave land to the railroad companies as a land grant, and gave them a little extra, not just the right-of-way, not just the rail bed, and made no restrictions on what was constructed. So the railroads would then advertise to folks in the eastern part of the United States and in Europe, in Ireland, and England, and other places, say, we've got towns, we need people. We have the land, we have it cheap, come build this town. And they would set these towns up every 10 miles or so they had a place to refuel and get water for their steam engines. And people would come and move into the towns. And you'll see the development of Iowa is very much influenced by this at that time. And the railroad executives, who's going to name these towns? They decided, like their daughter, they named the town after their daughter, they named the town after their best friends. Ames, who knows who Ames, Iowa is named after? Oaks Ames, who was the friend of John Blair, who was in charge of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad as it came through Iowa in the 1870s and 1880s. So a few facts about rail in Iowa. In 1860, there were only 700 miles of track in the state. By 1880, there were the 5,400 that I talked about. By 1914, its peak year, there were 10,000 miles of rail track. And in 2010, there was 4,700 miles. Railroads have been abandoned, railroads have gone down. Railroads were under massive pressure from automobile and burgeoning truck traffic starting in the 1920s. Passenger rail, for the most part, disappeared. Well, it took time. I mean, this is a decades-long compression and generalization. You'll have to forgive me for that. But passenger rail practically disappeared, and freight rail diminished as well as more things went onto the highway. But that's not to say rail in Iowa is dead. As recently as 2010, there were 54 million tons of freight that originated in Iowa and went somewhere. And there were 42 million tons of freight that came from somewhere and terminated or were delivered in the state of Iowa. 229 million tons of freight passed through, and it seems like at about 1 a.m., 5 a.m., and 7 a.m., most of that's coming by my house in North Ames and through downtown in the middle of the day when you're trying to cross into downtown. And since 1985, the tons of rail freight originating in Iowa, and this is obviously 1985, following on the farm crisis, when the early part of the farm crisis, when a lot of that agriculture, farm owners went down and exports went down, has increased by 160%. And the tons of rail freight terminating in Iowa, being delivered here, have increased by nearly 100%. And the tons of rail freight traveling through Iowa has increased by 129%. So rail is far from dead. And as we face a future that's very uncertain with fossil fuels and whatnot, most of those trains now run on diesel, and we have to start to wonder what's going to be next. And as our roads are clogged with trucks, or as a former truck driver would say, clogged with passenger cars, we really need to drive somewhere else. And we're burning up that fuel. It will come to an end. The supply is finite. When? That's an excellent question. What do we need to do next? Do we need to move more freight to rail, more passengers to rail? I think that's still an open question, and one that the DOT will obviously be faced with at some point in its future. Let's talk a little bit about aviation in Iowa, because this was a fun part to learn about. This was kind of crazy. I had no idea. I should have had some inkling that aviation was big in Iowa. My uncle owns his own small plane. Built it in his basement, put a hole through the floor to get it out of the house. My aunt got the carpet out of the deal, so she was pretty excited. And he's crash landed a couple times in farms and once in the Mississippi, and has lived to tell the tale, fortunate guy. But there's always been a little bit of an aviation mania in Iowa. That first balloon, the first manned balloon flight, the Hercules in 1856, took place down in Burlington and was piloted by Professor Silas Brooks. The first man-carrying glider, a boy-carrying glider, really, was Carl Bates in 1898. He was 14 years old when he flew his glider at Clear Lake. The first plane, the first powered airplane flown in the state in 1910 was built by Arthur Hartman, again at Burlington. Something about Burlington, and I don't know if there's a good landing field there, or the winds are good there, or what. And in 1924, very important event, the first licensed black male pilot in the country, in the United States, was licensed here in 1924. His name was J. Herman Bannon, and he came to Iowa to attend Iowa State College in 1919, and then started to operate the J. Banning Auto Repair Shop at Ames from 1922 to 1928. I don't think he graduated, and as somebody else who dropped out in 87 and came back to my undergraduate in 2007 and worked in between, I have sympathy for him. And his shop was located at 2nd Street and 4th Street, various places. In spring of 1924, he began taking flying lessons at Fisher's Flying Field down in Des Moines, and he became the first black aviator to obtain a license from the U.S. Department of Commerce. They were the body in charge of that at the time. He later moved to California to join Bessie Smith, the famous black female aviator, and her flying club called, I don't remember that now, but it was her barnstorming club, because after the war she was very much into barnstorming shows and whatnot, and Herman Banning did a lot of the same things. Who knows the name of the plane that Herman Banning flew, or can read it on the sign behind me? It was the Miss Ames, named after the town here. And finally, the Iowa Aeronautics Commission, which I love that word, much better than aviation, was created in 1945. There had been a commission, sort of advisory commission back in the 1930s. It became a full government body in 45. And again, its job was to license pilots, was to improve airports, and develop air flight in the state of Iowa. In 1947, there were 195 airports in the state of Iowa, which sort of per capita was in the top 3 for the United States. People were crazy about flying. Again, sort of like our bad roads, it sort of mirrors our bad roads. Of those 195 airports, 7 had concrete runways, 7 had asphalt or some other hard surface runways, hopefully not gravel, it would be a terrible thing to land on. And 181 were turf or grass. And any of you who have ever played in Iowa and have fallen on the grass knows that's not a soft landing. So I can only imagine the bumpy ride that you were in for if you were landing in grass in Iowa. Currently, the DOT Office of Aviation estimates that air transport in Iowa supports more than 47,000 jobs, has an annual payroll of $2.7 billion, and a total economic impact of more than $5 billion every year. So aviation plays, a substantial part in our Iowa economy. Trivia break 2. Iowa's contribution to national transportation. And, with 100,000 miles of dirt roads that had to be improved, and the Highway Commission working on it every day, there was bound to be certain things that were developed here in Iowa that played a part in transportation history and in transportation development across the country. And this is one of those things. Who knows what this is? Is this a dune buggy? Is it a tree planter? Is it a really short corn detaster? Is it a slip-form paver? Yes, it's a slip-form paver. And this is certainly one of Iowa's most important contributions to highway engineering. This slip-form paver prototype was built in 1949 here at the Iowa Highway Commission Labs in Ames. And what's important about a slip-form paver, I mentioned it and it was developed by Jimmy Whitmore Johnson and some other engineers at the labs, is that you didn't have to put out the forms, you didn't have to and stake them to the ground, you didn't do all that manual work. The slip-form paver, you could pour the concrete in the front end, the paver had moved forward, and have nice formed lanes coming out behind. And it's sort of one of those futuristic sorts of things you can see in the Disney videos of the world of tomorrow. They're building the road, and the cars are right behind them as they're building the road. It's practically the same thing. However, this particular slip-form paver can only do one lane at a time, and when they would lay the one lane, and then they'd come back and lay the other lane the other way, but the tire got in the way. So then they have to go through and patch that middle bit, and that wasn't very, that was the part that tended to fail a lot, was that strip in the middle. And like I'd said earlier, you could lay about 1,000 feet of concrete in a day with the old manual forms. With the slip-form paver, you can now do up to a mile a day, 50 feet wide. And a modern slip-form paver doesn't look anything like that. It looks much more like this. And I think this is where they're laying the road outside of Iowa State and Coral, but I might be wrong about that. But basically, concrete goes in at one end, and the vibrated and finished road comes out the other. Built here in Iowa. Iowa contribution number 2. Which of these was first designed and deployed in the state of Iowa? How many people think it has to be the deer crossing sign? How many people think it's the merge sign? How about the stop sign? Ubiquitous stop sign. And the no passing zone sign. The no passing zone sign, absolutely. And this was an experiment that began in 1959 to help cut down head-on collisions. And this pennant was then subsequently adopted and included in the National Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways. That's a really boring title for a book that's about this thick, with page after page of exactly when you use a sign, how big it has to be, how reflective it has to be, and how high off the ground it should be for people to see it. This experimental no passing zone sign was actually erected in December of 1958, so cold, and you can see a little bit of snow on the ground day along Interstate 30, just outside of Ames. And they, as an experiment, they did the entire stretch of US 30 from Clinton to the Missouri River. So here's a few more recent history highlights. And these are things that we're still working on for getting them onto the website in the future, so you'll have things to look forward to. And actually, I'm responsible for writing these too, so I better get busy. The Sioux Calumet. And I'm not sure that people really know this story, so this is one that I want to tell, because I live with this every day. This Calumet is actually on display in the DOT library, so I see it every day. And it was one of the first questions I had to answer for myself when I came to work at the DOT library is, what's in this case? Why is it in the library? And should it be in the library? On September 11th, 1982, Mendel Waconton, Dakota Chief Ernest Wabasha II, and Yankton Sioux Maria Pearson presented the Iowa DOT Director Warren Dunham. Here you see Maria and Governor Ray with the calumet, or ceremonial pipe, or sometimes mistakenly called a peace pipe, ceremonial pipe, as a symbol of trust and new relations between the Iowa DOT and Iowa's Native American communities. Now, archaeologists estimate that at one time Iowa had 50,000 native burial mounds, sites sacred to Native Iowans. Over the decades of Euro-American development, starting in the 1800s, these sites were cleared, paved over, built through, what have you. And so that now there are approximately 10,000 left. It was as if somebody came to your family plot in whatever town you happen to live in Iowa and threw a house on top of it. And the artifacts and bones, when they were bothered with at all, were sent to museums for study rather than reinterred. And this pattern was repeating itself in 1971 on a construction project along US 34. And a number of graves were impacted by the project. The remains of 26 European Americans were reinterred in a nearby cemetery, while the bones of a Native woman and her child were sent to the state archaeologist for study. Now, Maria Pearson, or by her native Sioux name, Running Moccasins, learned of what was going on from her husband, John, who was an Iowa Highway Commission engineer at the time, a district And this unequal treatment upset her. And so she decided to do something about it. She put on her regalia, she went to Governor Ray's office and asked to talk to him about the situation. So Maria's advocacy for Native American burial rights then led, in 1976, to a change in the Iowa Burial Code in state law, providing protection for Native American graves and for the repatriation of human remains in Native American cemeteries. There's 4 special cemeteries in the state of Iowa designed for the repatriation of Native American remains when they can't be dealt with in any other way. Iowa was the first state in the nation to have a repatriation law such as this. And it laid the groundwork really for the 1990 federal Native American grave protection and repatriation. Maria Pearson was sort of a hero amongst Native Americans and other folks concerned about this issue. And she went on to act as a special advisor to Governor Ray, to Governor Branstad, and to the Iowa Department of Transportation. She was at the Department of Transportation until not long before she died. The Iowa DOT altered its construction practices to meet this new thinking, this new law in the 1970s, and began designing roads in consultation with the tribal nations of Iowa to avoid any other native burial sites when possible, and when not possible, to very respectfully return the artifacts and the remains to the tribes when they're encountered. And the Weaver Bypass in southeastern Iowa is an example of this. It wasn't possible to redesign the road, but we have a very nice look at the DOT library, you're welcome to come and look, that describes the process of repatriation, but also talks about the history of the place among natives and shows us some of the technology and the pottery and whatnot, and how these folks lived. The calumet that was presented to the Department of Transportation in 1982, as I said, is housed in a special display case built for that purpose. It sits in the Iowa DOT library where I get to look at it every day. And I hope that, that you're welcome to come. I invite you all. The DOT library is open anytime the DOT offices are open to come and have a look and find out a little bit more about the history of the calumet. And then, of course, besides the people of Iowa, we also have to be concerned about the environment. It is what sustains us all. And the DOT took a new approach to its to the environment with the building of the US 20 bridge at the Iowa River that was completed here in the early 2000s. And environmental concerns weren't huge. In the early days of road building, roads were just laid on the section lines on the map, which is why most of them are straight, come to 90-degree angles to each other, and the bridge was thrown down wherever it was needed. And it didn't matter who was living or what was living under it or around it. And this has changed more in recent decades as we've realized the impact that this has on our environment and our quality of life. And when the DOT got to the Iowa River Valley, as they were creating a 4-lane in both directions, US 20, they had a choice to make. Because the Iowa River Greenbelt is about a mile wide, and it's a preservation zone, and it contains some of the last examples of prehistoric plants, of native remains, of endangered species, of early settler life, and it's also home to a great many of Iowa's bald eagles. So they wanted to make a minimal impact on the place. And one of the things about building roads and building bridges is that there can be a lot of pollution, a lot of runoff, a lot of chemicals, a lot of steel, a lot of cutting lubricants that can get into the environment if you're not careful. So in order to minimize the impact on the environment, US 20 was routed in such a way that it would only take up 10 acres of that green belt, and then the bridge was built using a new method called launching. And basically, with launching, the picture's a little out of focus, but you can see the white piers that come down from the bridge deck to the ground and hold it up. So you go down there, you pour the concrete pads, you put those piers into place, you've got to disrupt the ground a bit, and you do it as gently as possible. The tricky part comes in laying the steel understructure before you pour the deck. Because if you put it in one beam at a time and tie those beams together with iron workers working over that gap, there's a lot of sparks and a lot of waste and a lot of shards and liquids and stuff running down into the green belt below. In order to avoid that, the bridge was launched. The steel understructure, basically a pit was built that was completely water controlled. so that no runoff would get down into the river or into the greenbelt. And then the steel structures were put up on rollers and connected, and all the welding, all the cutting, and all the fittings were done there. And then those tons and tons of steel were launched out into space and hopefully landed on the pier without knocking it down. Of course, they were much more careful about it than that. And none of the piers fell down, although according to reports from people who were standing there waiting to catch the steel understructure, when that came down, there was a little bit of sway. So, it wasn't, it's a chancy proposition. And it's a lot of engineering to put into building a bridge in order to protect the environment of the plants and animals living under it. And the U.S. DOT was actually honored in 2005, after the completion of the project, by the National Partnership for Highway Quality with the National Achievement Award for this bridge and for the low impact that it had on the environment. So that sort of leads us to the future, to the conclusions in the future. We're winding down here. Transportation in Iowa has changed dramatically over 175 years that we've been a state. Did I get that number right? It's around that, right? From the early days of human and animal power to rail, to powered watercraft, autos and trucks, and to powered flight. Tremendous change. And, there were the modes I didn't get a chance to talk about at all, like public transit. Iowa has a rich public transit history. When Chicago was deciding to build its elevated rail in the Loop, where did they go to see an example of one in Sioux City? In the late 1800s, Sioux City had the first electrified elevated tracks. They were the third steam electrified, but they were the first to electrify. A re-examination of walkable and bikeable cities that's going on right now. People used to walk, not only to the small towns, but around in the small towns. There's the repurposing of rail beds that's going on right now in order to make trails and walking paths, in order to improve the quality of our leisure time. And of course, there's the question of passenger rail. The Iowa DOT Department of Rail has a plan for improved passenger rail, the reintroduction of passenger rail really here in Iowa, and this is the picture, this is what they're sort of working toward. Not only the Southern Amtrak line through Osceola, which doesn't go where anybody lives, but rail between Omaha, Des Moines, the Quad Cities, and Chicago, which would actually, and rail north and south to Minnesota and points to the south. That could relieve some highway congestion and relieve some of the resource needs that our current forms of transportation require. The one thing that we can say for sure is, human and natural systems are dynamic. They change, and sometimes they change in a few hours. There wasn't going to be snow today on Sunday, and now suddenly there's 6 inches out there. We can't always predict that. But what we can do is learn from our past and apply what we learned to our planning for the future. And I hope, as the DOT librarian, I play a small part in that by helping to keep the information organized. One of the things that maybe you don't know about the Iowa DOT, I hit on some of the highlights here, is we also turn out report after report after report. We research pretty much everything we do. And we write up reports, and they get sent to me at the library, and I put them in other libraries, and I put them in central databases, so that other states can learn from us. But other states do the same thing. And one of the things that I do is find in the research they've done, so that we don't end up repeating exactly what they did and waste research money. But the transportation systems, the departments across the country work together in order to build a better transportation infrastructure. There's a lot of difference of opinion, though. People aren't always sure which is going to be the rest of it. I know everybody in Iowa is not excited about passenger rail, but the DOT did do a survey of Iowans to find out what they thought about passenger rail. Heck, the DOT did a survey of Iowans at the rest areas to see which ones needed to be upgraded next. Any that haven't already been upgraded, that one outside of Bettendorf in Scott County, it's time. 40 years, time enough. I think the hand dryer is 40 years old. But we try to learn from what we've done in the past in order to make our future better. But it's not just the DOT. as I noted with people like Herman Banning and other folks, transportation history is made by people outside of the DOT, outside of the Highway Commission. It's made sometimes by the citizens of Iowa. And you all have a part to play in that. I mean, there's being active citizens, voicing your opinion, helping the state make the best choices for its future transportation, but also then telling us what you remember from the past, helping us learn our history. The DOT history has gaps. There's holes missing. There's information missing. There's little holes here and there. And those are your stories. Maybe your family has a complete collection of license plates, like the ones pictured out in the lobby, or you had a particular route that you would take to get to Grandma and Grandpa's house on Christmas that you remember fondly, or that something significant happened on. Those are the sorts of stories that we want to hear this year, this anniversary year, as we put more information up on the website, as we collect information. And so I would encourage you, on your way out, there's a printed bibliography of things you can read of, like, I don't know, transportation in Iowa, historical summary. Actually, very good, but stops in 1985. So current things aren't really listed in there. But, check out what's on the website. Go to the conversations part, comment on the story, tell us your stories. Also, you can share using Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, whatever social media you like. And I'm inviting all of you to email me personally. Do I really want to do that? Is my email inbox big enough for that? To tell me your stories. What stories should we be including on the DOT website, on the Conversations blog as we're going forward? You can also, if you don't want to use the email, you can write me a letter and put a stamp on it. I have a correspondence going with a man over in Mason City who sends me pictures and asks me to identify things and sends me lots of questions, and we send letters back and forth, and I always appreciate getting a letter from John. And we're very serious that we hear from you. The website is meant to be interactive. It's not only the DOT voice, but as a body of the state of Iowa, of its citizens, we want the citizens also to participate, as I believe they really should. And so that's not all I got. That's all I got. That's all I got time for tonight. So thank you very much.
Are there questions for Leighton? Anything you want to ask?
Got one on the aisle.
Is the library located at the DOT on Lincoln Way now? I understood at one time most of it was transferred out to Research Center.
The Research Center, the Institute for Transportation, has its own library, the Stan Ring Library. The DOT has had a library since 1970, and it's still on site. At one point, we were in the basement. Now we're at least up on the second floor. And if you look at the building from the east side, we're under the red roof. We're up on the second floor that connects the two parts of the administration building to the materials building. And we are open to the public any hours that the DOT is open. Typically, we're staffed, I can't even guarantee it, 9 to 4. Since there's only one of them and a part-timer, there are days when there's nobody at the library, sadly to say. But we're open to the public from 9 to 4, and you're welcome to come in anytime the DOT offices are open. You just have to check in at the front desk, since we are a secure building, check in at the front desk and get a visitor's pass, and come on up. I suggest, if there's something particular you're looking for in the collection, you've got a particular interest in a road or something, that you email or call me first, and we'll set up time, and I'll spend some time with you when you get there to help you with your researches. I recently helped an author working on a book about US Highway 6. He was there for the whole day, but I made sure that I was there to help him out.
Other questions?
Why was the Highway Commission located in Ames? Was it because of the college?
It's because of Iowa State, because it was an engineering school pretty much from its beginning. And that's where the engineers were at. There was no point in having the DOT down in Des Moines where the engineers weren't. And then that really became settled, once the city of Ames donated the land, the 5 acres for the building. And it was like, okay, this is where we're going to stay. And there's always been a tight connection between the DOT, Ames, and Iowa State since then.
I'm curious, what kinds of reference questions you get at the library?
Well, the most important thing that I do at the DOT library, my main purpose, is to further the research and engineering that goes on at the library. So when engineers are working on a research project, they call me and they say, we want to do this research project. Has anyone else done it? What's the literature on it? What's been written on it? I go out, I find that sort of stuff so that they have a running start. So they know they're not duplicating somebody else's work, but they're taking another step forward, and so that they know that they have the most current, most up-to-date information on whatever type of bridge deck they're building or whatnot, before they go forward with the project. That's the most important thing I do. The most fun that I have is answering reference questions from the people of Iowa. And John, the man I was mentioning in Mason City, he sent me, this was my second week as the librarian at the DOT, and he sends me a picture, and he sends me a question. Can you look at this picture of my mother and her friend from around 1917 and tell me what kind of machine they're standing in front of? Here's the exact picture that I got. Scanned at District 6, Mason City, and sent via email to me. And I did some serious looking. I looked at that piece of equipment, and I was like, what can I see from this view of this piece of equipment that will help me find it? And I identified these unique features of the equipment, and part of it was the arched supports for the hard top and the tarp that rolled down it. The other was the giant flywheel, the takeoff wheel, for when you hook that traction engine up to a belt and run another piece of equipment. And the other was, it was obviously, from what I could tell, it seemed to be like a steam or power roller, because the one set of wheels was really wide, looked like a roller. And I looked through all sorts of sources of equipment, searching for rollers and whatnot, and I found this Austin Western road roller in Good Roads magazine on the internet. And I looked at that and I'm like, oh, I think that's it. It's the one on the top there. And I was very fortunate to find a picture on somebody's Flickr site from the exact same angle that the women are standing at. And here it is, and every point matches exactly to what the piece of machinery that John's mother was standing in front of with her friend. And John only asked me about his mother and her friend. In January, he sent me the actual picture. He sent me a copy. He had his friend scan it and email it for me. I want to know who's the guy who's got his arms around the two women. John didn't even know there was a guy in the picture until I pointed it out to him. He's like, who's got his hands on your mother? What's going on with that? And taking a second look at that picture, I'm feeling I'm absolutely right that that's an Austin motor roller built in 1913. The other thing that's important about the motor roller at that time is it didn't have a tall exhaust stack on the front. It had that little bell, which is sort of behind his hat, which is sort of the radiator cap. There's no huge exhaust stack, and the later equipment all has giant exhaust stacks. So this is certainly the most fun that I have, and I had to include this in the slideshow because this is the sort of stuff that I really like, and if you send me lots of pictures, I'll be really happy. John also very graciously donated this picture and a couple others of his mother standing in 1924 in her wedding dress on an old, I haven't identified the car yet, but it's got the 1924 Iowa license plate. He's donated them to the library. So we will include those later on in our digital collection. And that's the sort of thing that I hope that people will do in the 100th anniversary is tell me the stories of transportation that relate to your family. And so those will be the reference questions I'm looking forward to this year.
Wonderful, Leighton. God, what a great story. Other questions? Give this guy a round of applause.